Our next speaker is Simon Smith. He is a former detective and he also regularly organizes training seminars for interpreters. He will highlight some of the key issues in terms of relevant legislations interpreters should be aware of, and of course the challenging terminology that comes with it. We will also see, I think, a visually recorded interview, a simulation, of course, with a potential victim for a hands-on activity. So, Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm hoping people can hear me. And thank you very much to Joe for a fascinating input as always. I always enjoy listening to the research that Joe conducts. And thank you also to the CIOL for organising this event, because I know only too well through organising these events just how much work that takes. So that's fantastic. And it's also fantastic to see hundreds of people in the audience as well. So welcome to all. One of the things that I've been doing from the police side for a good number of years now is really promoting the need for training with interpreters, joint training with police and interpreters. And I didn't get very far working as a detective, and a fairly prominent detective within training as well. Hence me sort of running my own events 5 years ago and seeing thousands and thousands of interpreters ever since. Interpreters, mostly self-employed, really see the need for CPD. Unfortunately, my experience is the police do not. Hence the reason why 94% of the audience today by the poll are experienced or are translators or interpreters, and 0% are police officers. So it's nice to see this sort of statistics backing up my sort of personal experience and views. Joe mentioned a lady called Katrina Mayfield, very good interpreter and very keen on education as well. We ran some events 5 or 6 years ago, and Katrina's also done a lot of research, and I think we are getting there quickly, and it's nice to see the police nationally starting to put together some sort of guidance, which Joe did introduce, and I'm grateful for. As mentioned, 20 odd years of experience of investigating these sort of offences, and lots of experience of working with interpreters with these sort of offences. And one of the things that I've found with educating interpreters over the last 5 years specifically is that the level of knowledge of these sort of offences is very low, and only 5% of the audience seemingly experienced within it, or extensively experienced. So again, it's great that this event is on now, and we can maybe have a look at some of the issues around interpreting these sort of offences. What I would say as interpreters is that this is a boom industry, and it might sound quite harsh, that, and what I mean by that is the demand for interpreting services across these sort of offences, in my view, are increasing all of the time, and that's because awareness and the amount of investigations of this nature are increasing all of this time. So this is a really exciting area of work for you to get into. Sensitive, but very, very rewarding in terms of how you help vulnerable people and in some way take dangerous people off the streets. Now, one of the things that we do at Zakon as well is we run through all of the Gangmaster Labour and Abuse Authority serious crime training, and again that's around police and court interviewing, interpreting, suspect interviewing, disclosure. And one of my objectives today set by the CIOL was to introduce sort of some key definitions and key terms. So GLAA is the agency, or one of the main agencies, responsible for sort of prosecuting crimes of slavery, and it may well be not just police officers, but it may well be sort of staff from there that you will work with as well. Now, not all of the GLAA work is simply about prosecution. They also manage licenses for gangmasters, so it may well be that you're involved in interpreting on a licensing issue, not just sort of criminal offences. Okay, if we sort of start to move on and have a look at, just bear with me, for some reason my PowerPoint doesn't want to move. There we go. Okay, so what we want to do today is actually have a look at some of the definitions of modern slavery. and human trafficking. And the reason for that is some of the language is very unique to these sort of offences. And actually, as an interpreter and an officer, what I've found over the years is being familiar with some of the details of the offences before you go into an interview or into court is very useful indeed, because cognitively it's a very demanding process interpreting. I don't need to tell the audience that in any way, shape or form. So the more awareness and understanding of some of the issues and sort of offences that will crop up beforehand is useful for you. One of the things that we'll talk about, the key offences that can be committed under Part 1 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015. Now, just to give you an idea of the severity that Parliament take modern slavery offences, is Part 1 of the Modern Slavery Act carries lifetime imprisonment. So it's up there with kind of rape, armed robbery, terrorism and homicide in terms of the level of sentencing that a court can impose on offences of modern slavery. So if you arrive at a police station, it could be your first assignment, and if it's a modern slavery offence, potentially that offence could well be played out within the Crown Court, and somebody could get a serious jail sentence on the back of it. Therefore, your work and the investigation is likely to be tested far more robustly than potentially offences of minor theft, minor assault, etc. So that's just to kind of give you an idea of the severity. You may also be thinking, well, how come the Modern Slavery Act is in 2015? We've had slaves for centuries. Well, for a long time, slavery really in Parliament wasn't something given specific focus in terms of legislation, yet slavery was on the increase for a long time. So they wrote into legislation in 2015 specific offences dealing with it. And one of the reasons why we're still playing catch up is that the legislation is relatively new, which may well also explain why a large percentage of the audience have never come across these offences. Okay, we'll look at some of the unique terminology present in modern slavery in human trafficking investigations. And the idea of me giving you this information today is you can sort of get used to these terms and phrases prior to going into a police station to reduce some of that sort of cognitive demand when you get there, because some of the terms aren't normal in other areas of language. You know, we may talk about debt bondage, slavery, servitude, gangmaster, all sorts of terms that we wouldn't ordinarily come across in usual language. Okay, and at the end of the presentation, I'm aware that you know, a lot of this is sort of PowerPoint led with it being online. I'll actually play a video of a complainant of modern slavery being interviewed. And again, the majority of the audience will never have seen this, yet you could turn up tomorrow and be asked to interpret one of these interviews. So again, getting the chance to have a look at one of those will give you a chance not just to see how one of these interviews is run, but also you can take that away with you and have some reflection and extra information that you can carry on your learning beyond this input. Okay, how much modern slavery is there in the UK? Simple snapshots that we found on the web. It's absolutely all over the place. So if you are in that vast majority of people that have never dealt with it, maybe never seen it, maybe never really heard of it or know what it is, that's absolutely fine. There's a term that we have and that's hidden in plain sight. It's going on all around you. I live up in sort of rural Lincolnshire. I can drive down a country lane here and I can see slavery all around me in terms of labour exploitation on farmland, for example. Not all of it, some of it is licensed with licensed gangmasters, but it goes on all around us. And you can see just a few sort of snapshots there. And it's not just one particular group of people. You can see there the sort of children, it goes right the way across the board. So if you've got a stereotype of the sort of demographics of people that may well be affected, then please throw those away, because nobody or no group of people particularly are you know, not potentially victims of slavery. And Joe gave some sort of statistics on various nationalities as well, and the various forms of slavery that they may be more likely to become susceptible to. Okay. So Part 1 of the Modern Slavery Act 2015 deals with slavery, servitude, forced or compulsory labour. So again, some unique terms there for you to get around, and there are some more complex definitions of those that you may wish to go away and research even more, but that's the basic summary of part 1: slavery, servitude, forced or compulsory labour. And section 2 deals with human trafficking. Now, the Act itself, and the full legislation is on Zakon's website, but the Act itself goes into hundreds of pages. These are the main two, the most serious two offences that you can deal with. Hence, they're the ones that we will focus on today. So as you get a chance to sort of get your heads around those. And one of the reasons why it's useful to understand some of the key pieces of legislation is with an interview process, investigators will ordinarily aim to build a case by proving particular points within the legislation that there will be required for prosecution. Hence, a lot of these terms and points will come out and you will be needed to interpret. So, looking at slavery, servitude, forced and compulsory labour, the following definitions come from the Crown Prosecution Service, or CPS. You may well know. Jokingly, you may hear officers calling them the Criminal Protection Service, and some of Joe's research was interesting around some of the comments, and my experiences, I could almost hear them in the room. So that's kind of a bit of an in-joke there. The UK Human Trafficking Centre and the Palermo Protocol. You may not be aware of any of those three agencies. I would assume most people are aware of the CPS. The UK Human Trafficking Centre is actually part of the National Crime Agency, and you can research some of these things in your own time. You don't need me to do that for you. They help with intelligence and tactical advice for human trafficking offences. And they also manage something called the National Referral Mechanism. And again, I'm aware that I'm putting lots and lots of terms your way, but again, you can go away and research these. And that means before you walk into the police station, you will have an awareness over these sort of things. The National Referral Mechanism is simply a framework that outlines roles and responsibilities of agencies to identify and assist victims. And you could be asked to interpret for any number of agencies, because there are so many agencies now that are involved in or can potentially be involved in slavery and human trafficking offences. The Palermo Protocol, that's simply a UN convention set up to suppress slavery and trafficking. But the interesting thing with that is that it's signed by nearly 200 member states. So you can see the sort of impact, weight and power that the combined three have there when we look at the definitions. Okay, slavery in its most basic form is simply the status or condition of a person over whom any or all of the powers attached to the right of ownership are exercised. And as with a lot of definitions, they don't trip off the tongue particularly easily. However, if I was to summarize that, I would simply say that slaves are simply seen as property. Absolutely horrible. They are simply a commodity for exploitation. They are property belonging to a slave master for exploitation and abuse. And this is all around us. It's never gone away. And a lot of people, even colleagues, have sort of over the years said, well, slavery was abolished many, many, many years ago. That simply isn't the case. Servitude is a particularly serious form of denial of freedom, and that came in the case of Slavery v France 2006, and that's the European Court of Human Rights. That abbreviation is there. Slavery was a Togolese national in France, an unpaid servant who had her passport confiscated. She basically challenged the government to say that the laws of the land weren't doing enough to protect her. And the court agreed that she'd been held in servitude and had been asked to perform forced and compulsory labour. However, they did hold that the applicant wasn't necessarily in slavery in what they call the traditional sense. But that definition of servitude is the one that we will use. It also includes the obligation on the victim to live on the other's property and the perceived impossibility of the victim changing their status. So again, you've got exploitation and control within that definition there. I'm trying to summarize quite extensive cases into the key points there. So this effect of living on other people's property, it doesn't necessarily even mean locking them in to a building or into a caravan, as you see there. It is that psychological coercive control where victims don't feel that they're able to leave property, and the passport being confiscated. Expect that to come up in a large number of interviews, because that is one of the ways in which slavery victims are often controlled, and they will often get tied into a debt to the slave master, a debt bondage, an impossible debt that will never ever be paid back. Forced and compulsory labour. It's defined by the European Court of Human Rights and the International Labour Organisation. So ILO, that may be another organisation that you're not aware of that gets involved within this particular area of business, and that's a UN agency, and its mandate is to advance social and economic justice through setting international labour standards. And what's interesting with a lot of human trafficking and slavery offences, protocols, legislation, guidance, is how it does cross many different countries, as opposed to be it specifically just sort of English or English and Wales legislation. They define forced or compulsory labour as all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty, and for which the said person has not offered himself voluntarily. Now, what is really interesting here is the word menace, and the menace may well be not getting fed, right the way through to, if you don't do what I say, then I will break your mum's legs back home in Lithuania. And again, Joe did say that some of the topics that we discussed may well be sensitive, and that example was a live case where that actually happened. So you can see here that the people that exploit slaves have absolutely no morals and will go to any length to exact a menace in order to get profit from individuals. The Palermo Protocol defines human trafficking as quite lengthy, but look at some of the key words: the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or a position of vulnerability, of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person, and all of that for the purpose of exploitation. So the CIOL will share these slides with you, and it is worth just having a look at some of the terms within there, because they are the sort of terms that will really be questioned about in some detail potentially during interviews. And you can see that it's all there for the purpose of the exploitation. Just one thing, you may be sat there and it may be a question later, people may well be asking now, well, isn't that smuggling? Well, no, smuggling of humans, ordinarily there would be consent from that person to be smuggled. It may well be for illegal migration, if they're escaping poverty, for example, but they will consent to being smuggled. Trafficking is as it says there, for the purpose of exploitation, and again, that will be without consent, or if there is consent, it won't be true consent, because there'll be some sort of menace behind that. Offence is committed where a person holds someone else in slavery or servitude, or ought to know they are in slavery or servitude. Now, the word ought is very interesting, because to commit a crime, we need a guilty action or actus reus with a guilty mind, i.e. mens rea. Ought to know is interesting because ordinarily, how you find out whether somebody knows in their mind whether somebody's in slavery can normally only be addressed with question and answering. So that is where the interpreter will come in, particularly there, and there'll be a range of questions around sort of the mental the mental state or the mental knowledge, if you like, of either victim or suspect. So be prepared for that. Or requires another person to perform forced or compulsory labour and knows or ought to know that they are being so required. Consent, pretty much largely irrelevant, and the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, will often, thankfully, prosecute cases even where victims don't consent. And one of the challenges that I've found through experience over the years of dealing with victims of slavery is often they don't see themselves as being victims. They often will say, well, it's better here than it was back at home, etc. So there is a real challenge there around sort of getting victims to consent if they maybe do genuinely feel indebted to their gangmaster. You know, and that's a complex subject for another time maybe. Any factors affecting vulnerability to slavery, e.g. children, family relationships, mental or physical illness can be taken into account. My experience is that generally speaking, the more vulnerable somebody is, the more likely there will be to become a slave, because it's easier for the gangmaster, the abuser, to get them on board and to get them to do what they want. The consent of the victim to any of the acts does not necessarily present a conviction, as I previously mentioned. Okay, human trafficking, I'm mindful of time, so we'll have a look at that briefly. That's part 1 again, section 2. So remember what we said at the start, just as serious, lifetime imprisonment. And what is particularly good with regards to this offence is that it's truly international in the ways that it can be committed, and merely borders won't necessarily be a defence for perpetrators of these crimes. The offence is committed by anyone arranging or facilitating the travel of another person with a view to the other person being exploited. And exploitation is fairly common language, and in its most simple term, just means to take advantage of a person in order to profit or benefit, because as I said, humans are simply seen as a commodity for that benefit. It goes on to say consent to the travel is irrelevant. Be prepared, by the way, to have lengthy conversations or interviews that you'll need to interpret around consent, because the law around consent, particularly with sexual offences, is very, very lengthy, complicated, and there have been a number of stated cases, i.e. rulings within court around consent. So don't be surprised if consent comes up, particularly within sexual exploitation, and there's lengthy conversations with the investigators around it. So travel means arriving in, entering, departing from, or travelling within any country, and it's good to see that that is truly wide-reaching. Goes on to say the offence can be committed in any part of the world. The offender is a UK national. If the offender is not a UK national, either part of the arranging or facilitating must take place in the UK, or the travel must include arrival, entry, departure from, or travel within the UK. And there have been a number of high-profile cases over recent years where you would have seen that, you know, the unfortunate case of there were several dozen, I think around 40 immigrants in the back of a lorry that unfortunately passed away. So these are the sort of offences that anybody within that crime could potentially be committing. So we'll move on before we actually show you a visually recorded interview and actually just outline some of the common forms of slavery. And again, you can go away and research these. I've got information on these as well that I can point you to and pass your way for you to use. But you may well be asked in the visually recorded interview to try and spot which form of slavery you see. So that's a bit of a clue. Common forms of slavery, the most common involve labour exploitation, and I would suggest that that is probably, Joe may well have data for it, but my experience would suggest that is the most common form of exploitation is labour. And you'll often see that construction, farm workers, you know, people working in nail bars, trafficked often for the purpose of labour exploitations, exploitation and becoming slaves within. What's interesting is the real drive for putting the act together and getting to where we are now are the cockle pickers up in Morecambe Bay, probably around 15 years ago now or so, where they were exploited labour slaves and effectively lost that they lost their lives, and that really kick-started awareness of this because it made national news. So labour exploitation, very common. Sex exploitation, that is what it says. It's a sensitive subject. I won't go into specific details here because I don't necessarily know all of the audience, but it can be anything from low-level sexual exploitation in terms of the severity of the criminal offence, all the way up through to rape involving violence. Potentially people trafficked to become work within prostitution. So again, it borders labour exploitation. These sort of forms of slavery can mix and match and cross over each other. Domestic servitude. People will become slaves within domestic settings. Again, very common. I hear all sorts of figures bandied about from all sorts of places around data and statistics on how many people are slaves. The honest answer is, again, through experience, we simply do not know. We can only but guess, and some of the data varies wildly, because the term that I used earlier, hidden in plain sight, is exactly what it says. And the chances are there are slaves all around you, you just don't see them. Slaves can often be kept inside houses. Some of the cases we've had 15, 20, 25 years, and neighbours just simply do not know until there's police or agency intervention. Criminal exploitation, that is involves all of the above, but it's just a wider ranging form of exploitation where people are recruited to commit criminal behaviour. And the topical one at the minute, and the term that seems to be passed around a lot, is county lines, where people are using people within slavery to run illicit drug deals and that sort of thing. But again, it's a very wide-ranging area of slavery. And child exploitation, very sensitive. It may well involve labour, criminal, domestic, sexual exploitation as well within it. And again, I can send you some information following the presentation, where an easy read booklet where all of these particular offences are sort of defined and explained. I'm just mindful of the short time I have here. Okay, so in a nutshell, that was the key points of parts 1 and 2 and the forms of slavery. On the website, which is free to access, you know, we run and maintain it at great cost for free. So as you have a resource library, you can simply tap onto. Those screenshots there are just documents on the library simply relating to slavery and interpreters, specific to your work as interpreters and within slavery. So if this area of work does spike your interest, or even if you're very experienced within it, there's an awful lot of information there that you're free to use in the future. And the great thing is, the way that we host it on the website is they're all downloadable as PDFs. So if you are stuck in a police station or similar, and you are struggling to think, what does the law say about this? What's our regulations or guidance about that? Then it's all there at the click of a button for you. Because one of the things that I will say, kind of picking up on some of Joe's presentation, is that you may well turn up at a police station with somebody with 24 years service, such as me, that has never ever worked with an interpreter. Therefore, it may well be part of your role, and this may well come up after the exercise, is to have a briefing with the officer beforehand and actually explain what your role is, and vice versa. Because the way that I see interpreters, police, social workers, is that we're all independent professionals with the joint goal of working together to independently gather the thoughts of the victim or the suspect. That in a nutshell is what it is, and the better we work together, then the more effective the investigation will be, and the better we will achieve best evidence independently. So it may well be there's cultural issues between the police and interpreter. You know, I don't know, but please don't ever assume that that the interviewing officer is necessarily experienced in working with you. And I say exactly the same to officers. Please don't, anticipate the interpreter's been doing it for years. They may well turn up to an issue of human trafficking and it's their first case. So loads and loads of resources there. Please use those at your leisure. Okay. What we'll do now is we will have the opportunity, and I'm hoping the technology works well here, so I might need a little bit of help, to show you a visually recorded interview with a complainant of modern slavery. Now, I thought that was useful because I suspect the majority of the audience won't ever have seen a visually recorded interview with a complainant of modern slavery, because simply you can't log on the internet and find one. They are so sensitive that they would never be publicly available. So I created this video that we run on our workshops. It's a training video, therefore it's not real. And I have to make that caveat because people watch it and believe it's real. So this is typical of many, many cases I've dealt with, and you won't see any difference between this and one that you do for real within the workplace. Now, one of the reasons why this video is visually recorded is the law defines a modern slavery and human trafficking victim to be intimidated. Therefore, intimidated witnesses ordinarily will have their video recorded visually. And the thing for you to be aware of there is that all of your work and the investigator's work is on camera and laid bare for courts to see. So there is a little bit more pressure there. And that's just the way it is ultimately. So if you've not seen one, it may well be useful for you. There's some exercises that I would like you to do, and you can actually take this away and continue to reflect because the video is on YouTube for you to see. So if you're thinking back of sitting back now with popcorn and relaxing, then you really can't, because I'd like you to consider the following whilst watching the video. What form of modern slavery does the victim appear to be a complainant of within this particular case? So we had 5 forms on the last slide. So what form of modern slavery does the complainant appear to be a victim of? What challenges may you face in interpreting the questions and answers in this interview? So hopefully you're busy scribbling these down to think about during the video. What differences might your presence make, and where would you suggest that you should be positioned in the interview room? And the final point for you to sort of consider and answer and reflect on: if you were to interpret a visually recorded interview of this nature in the future, what information would you expect from the interviewer prior to the interview, and what information could you provide to assist them? Okay, and that's a question actually that's been previously raised by one of the panels, so that would be interesting there. Okay, so I now need to work out how to play this video. This may well be where Sahelia comes in. Claire, I understand that you told a police officer a few days ago that you've been kept in a house against your will.
About 5 years ago, I applied to an advert, and they needed somebody really quickly. It's a big house, and they've got 2 kids. They're doctors. They're out all day working. They both work at the hospital. They were really happy to have me. I've got a room. I've got a little room. It's right at the top of the house. The house is really big. I have to do a lot of stuff. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot of. I have to look after the kids, like when they're at home. I have have to feed them, and well, I have to feed everybody. I have to make sure that their kids are ready for school in the morning. I have to get up first because I'm not allowed to use any of the bathrooms except the kids' bathroom. So I have to get up right early to use that, and then I have to get them up. It's not always easy, but I have to get them up. But and then I have to get them dressed. They both go to school now, so I have to make sure their uniform is ready, and then give them breakfast, and then there's always a list of things to do. Sometimes I can do it without looking because I know, but when the kids have gone to school, sometimes I don't see them in the morning. I don't see Jennifer and, sorry, Dr. Jennifer. They like me to call them Dr. Jennifer and Dr. Graham. Sometimes I don't see them in the morning. They have there's another kitchen. I've only been to it a few times. There's 2 kitchens in the house, one right at one end, and that's where that's where I do most of my work. I feed the kids, and I prepare meals in there, and I have to take them through to the other kitchen, but I'm not allowed in the dining room. When the kids have gone to school, then I have to do the laundry and clear up their bedrooms and clear up any mess that's left in the places that I can go to. I have to I wash and I iron, and I have to get the Hoover out, and I just have to make sure it's tidy enough, because if it's not clean and tidy, she gets really, really cross. She doesn't always come home at the same time. She works shifts, and she never tells me when she's going to be back. So I have to be careful. I can't like stop what I'm doing. I can't like go and have a rest, or I can't put the telly on in the kids. They've got a playroom. I can't go and do that because she might come home at any time. I try really hard to keep on top of things and just do everything, like, so she hasn't got anything to come back on me for. And it's easy with the kids because they just drop their clothes everywhere, and I just pick them up and wash them, and when I first started, she was nice, and she showed me how things work. She showed me how the washing machine works. She showed me how the waste disposal thing in the other kitchen worked and everything. And now, like, there's rooms I'm not allowed to go to, but it's stupid. I'm not allowed to go in the main kitchen, but I'm supposed to put food away, and it's really difficult. I have to do it when the food delivery arrives. I have to do it while she's not there, before she comes back, because she finds me in the kitchen. Yeah.
Explain to me how the job came about.
It was a newsagent's, I think, and it just said domestic help or something. Ring this number, and I spoke to this woman, and she sounded really nice, and she said, oh, we really need help. I've got 2 children and my husband and I work long hours and we're struggling and we'd really like to meet you. And I felt really like, for the first time in ages, I felt really wanted, really appreciated. And I'm not even met her. Just as soon as I got there, she just started showing me around, and she was kind of in a bit of a rush. She said she had to go, and she just showed me where a few things were, and she showed me my room. When she came back, she said, she was quite happy with what I'd done, and all I'd done was give the kids some food and like played with them. She said, I think it was on that day, or it must have, or a few days later, I can't remember. She said that there were places that she would prefer I didn't go. I seem to remember that things just sort of, she didn't say when I first went there, I want you to do this, 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 and this. Things sort of kept creeping in. It was almost like she'd already told me and just expected me to know.
So, during all of this time, did you ever sign anything official or discuss payment?
No, there was no talk about money. When I was first there, she mentioned that my meals would be included, but as time went on, when I first started, I was allowed to eat with the children, but more recently, she said that I couldn't do that, and I just had to just grab leftovers and stuff. That's what I do now because it's just easier. If she sees me eating, she gets angry. And I was in the kitchen with the children, and we were having a nice time, and she came in, and I think she used the term pocket money or something like that. I really didn't know what to think because I didn't know if this was going to happen. I was just grateful for some money. And
so when you originally started work there, having seen the advert the day that Dave took you,
yeah,
tell me when that was.
Five years ago. 5 years ago.
And when did you leave?
2 days ago.
And just briefly explain to me the reason for you leaving.
Just too hard. They expected more and more and more from me. And I told her 6 months ago, about 6 months ago, it was summertime, I told her that I couldn't stay, and she just got really, really angry. She was screaming and shouting and swearing at me, and she said that I couldn't go because She had put so much time and money into putting a roof over my head and giving me somewhere to live and providing me with meals that I would never be able to repay her. So there was no question of me leaving. No matter how hard I try and I work and I do all the stuff she puts on the list, she still gets cross with me and she still expects so much. She's so unpredictable. I feel like I'm like walking on eggshells all the time. I was helping her stack presents under the tree. So many presents. And I said, stupid thing to say, I said something like, I don't know, it wouldn't have been so bad if one of those presents were for me. I hadn't been there that long then. I would never say anything like that to her now. She just dragged me up the stairs and she called me an ungrateful fucking bitch, and I was never ever to speak like that to her again. She grabbed my arm and she had me at the back of the neck as well, my hair. She was really strong. She pushed me into the little room. There's a little tiny bedroom on the landing where I have the little steps that go up to my room.
In all of those years, in those 4 or 5 years, how much money have you ever received, or have you received in total?
£30.
About £30. How long would your working day normally last?
I have to get the kids up. The bus comes to pick them up about 8, half 8. I have to be up about 5:30 because, like I said, I have to go through the bathroom, and sometimes they're really difficult to get up, and if they make a lot of noise I get in trouble, so I have to leave a lot of time to entertain them, to so I reckon about 5:30 most days. I get up early in the weekend too because there's loads to do.
And when would your working day typically end?
Not before midnight. She would call me a lazy fucking cow and tell me to get back to the list. Where's the list? Now I don't sit down because I will fall asleep. I can't do it. I have to just, because she could go out the door and then she could be back in 5 minutes because she's forgotten something or something. I have to. And she's weird. Sometimes she'll come back and she'll just, as though I'm not there. She'll just go on her laptop or just disappear, or she'll be at the other end of the house. Other times she'll just come and find me.
It's important, Claire, we just sort of understand the circumstances around those. So you tend not to leave the house. She says you have everything you need.
Yeah.
Are the doors physically always locked, or is it a decision that you make yourself for the reasons you've mentioned as to not leaving the house?
She makes it clear that I'm not allowed to go, and that I have been out. I have sometimes One time we went to the theatre. I was just taken to look after the kids. She's made it very clear that if I try and go, I was scared that if I got caught trying to leave, she'd make things even worse for me. And I still feel for the children. She's a children's doctor. She works.
Okay. Thank you, Sahili, in the background there, the engine behind the scenes there, coordinating all of this technology. I'm really grateful for you doing that. Hopefully, we managed to view the video, and for the majority of you, that the first time that you've seen a video of that nature, I hope you find it beneficial, and you can email me and I can pass you the web link for that on YouTube, so you can continue later to view it and maybe work more on the questions. And you've probably all got answers to the questions for yourselves, and some of it is subjective, but I'll just give you some key points to think about and take away. So what signs and symptoms of modern slavery does the complainant exhibit? You will hopefully have found from the last slide that she's a victim of domestic servitude there. There's clear forced labour, fear, distress, coercion, and a lot of that psychological. She won't leave a house where doors aren't locked. So domestic servitude, and again, a very underreported crime, probably going on within your own communities there. So describe the manner and demeanour of the interviewer. What do you think the reasons are for this? Okay, it's always difficult watching yourself, but some of the comments that I've just scribbled down here, hopefully calm and relaxed and independently gathering facts. Questions you would note hopefully were open, non-leading, without prejudice or bias. You will see there was a very cognitive style of interview, eliciting facts which may prove the case, but it was actually the interviewee that was providing the information. A cognitive style of interview is simply one where we have a substantial period of rapport and then pass power over to the interviewee, sit back, ask very open questions, listen, and let the complainant talk, do all of the talking and put the facts out there. One common fault with the majority of interviews that I see conducted by police officers is they simply ask too much questions. They are culturally trained to ask question after question after question. Therefore, the more questions they ask, the more prejudicial and leading the interview is likely to become. Barristers, and barristers I have on my courses, will tell me that they are now trained to really undermine the credibility of the investigation team, including interpreters, including all the other professionals involved. And if it looks like the interview is particularly leading or judgmental from the interviewing officer, they will make a real strong case for that in court. So the more I listen, the less I talk, then the less likely there is to be a challenge around that. You'll notice as well, I was dressed very informally. Again, there's a lot of psychology around kind of rapport and power and control, and the idea was that the interviewee felt that they were the one in power. And if I was dressed there in a stiff suit or a uniform, then it could help reduce that effect. Again, it's another area that we cover on some of the seminars that we run, but something to think about with yourselves as well. Explain what challenges you may face in interpreting the questions and answers in this interview. You may well find the language and terminology difficult because, again, there are some unusual phrases with no direct translation. Now, I'm experienced in working with interpreters. I understand that if there's a term that needs interpreting, that may well take a minute or two, even if it's a yes or no question. Some of my colleagues may well think you're having a conversation because you're mates. So therefore, it's essential in the briefing process that you do explain to officers that there may well be periods of time that you need to do that. So that is a challenge itself. I think the biggest challenge here for yourselves is the length of the recall. Because my style there was achieving best evidence in that it was a cognitive style, and that was an edited interview, some of the free recall that the interviewee had there was 15 or 20 minutes. You clearly cannot remember 15 or 20 minutes worth of information. Therefore, that needs to be broken down into bite-sized chunks. And this is where the presence of an interpreter can affect the quality of the recall. Because as I've said earlier, what we need to do is sit back and just listen so that the interviewee can effectively just speak to the jury. And the intervention of the interpreter causes complications in itself. So one of the things that I will do within the pre-interview briefing is say to his interpreters, you know, give me a look, a nudge, a sign, at which point you need to pause, and the witness will need to pause in order to let you relay the information back to me. You know, and that's an area we can talk about literally for hours and hours, but in a nutshell, there's something there for you to go away and reflect on and think about. So what difference might your presence make, and where would you suggest that you should be positioned in the interview room? In summary, where it's covered by camera, full view of interviewee, positioned towards them so they can engage audibly and visually, I would say. So I need to see you as the interviewer, as does the complainant, as do the cameras. And if this was in court, I can only compare it to the witness box, the barrister, and the jury. We call that the golden triangle, so that you can actually see all people in the interview room, because as you know, the body language is often as important as the spoken word when you're working within language. Finally, if you were assigned to interpret an interview of this nature in the future, what information would you expect from the interviewer prior to the interview, and what information could you provide to assist them? Well, in summary, it doesn't always happen, and of the several hundred interpreters I see year in, year out that work with the police, they will often say, I just don't get a brief in any way, shape or form. And really, we would particularly like one. Well, I can give you some ammunition now. Achieving Best Evidence Guideline states that you're entitled to one. It says that you should be involved in the planning process. You should have a clear understanding of the objectives of the interview, its structure and the function served by any specific techniques. For example, the cognitive interview that I use there. You won't be able to have all details of defence. The officer probably won't know them. But any information about the interviewee and surrounding circumstances would be particularly useful for you. I would want to know who it is you're speaking to. In some communities, it may well be that you are the only interpreter. I've had interpreters on some of my courses saying, do you know what, there's only me and one other person speaks this particular language and interpreter in the UK. So therefore, it's important to have those details. And don't forget
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Simon. It's really interesting. I'm afraid we are running out of time. Is it okay if I start the questions and answers sessions?
That's fine. I was just about to make my last point anyway.
Sure.
To move on.
Okay, so I'll start with some questions for Joe. It starts with a comment. Surely with people trafficking being the fastest growing form of organized crime, there is huge leverage on the government to provide more funding for interpreter training and provision. What has research shown in terms of government awareness of what precisely is involved?
Hi. I'm going to start by saying I don't know, because that's not what I've done research on. So I can certainly go off and look it up and see if there's been much done. I have contributed to some studies that have been done by the Cabinet Office and by others, looking at the effectiveness of resourcing for cross-language communication in various contexts. So there's definitely been some work done on it. But I would guess that, I mean, off the top of my head, I certainly haven't seen much. I think it's a huge problem. One of the roles I have is as deputy chair for the University Council of Modern Languages, which brings together all the higher education universities in the UK, which train in anything to do with languages. So that does include translation and interpreting. And certainly within the organisation, I'm not aware of any official data around the growing need for training in translation and interpreting. If anything, what we're seeing at the moment is a really worrying combination of pressures on university funding, which means, if anything, language departments, and obviously the way training usually happens is people build language competence and then train in translation and interpreting. They're shutting down across the piece. Even some of the really leading trainers are under threat at the moment. So Harriet Watt, one of our real trailblazers in the UK, is facing redundancies and threats of cutting programmes. We're hopeful translation and interpreting will be okay, but there are a lot of universities around the country which are looking at this as a question of resource. It's difficult to train interpreters and translators. It demands quite a lot of input compared to subjects like English literature or history, where you can have big lectures or bigger seminar groups, where the expertise is widely available. We're facing a really worrying crisis coming because we've also got a looming generational gap because of government policy in relation to language learning in schools in the UK. And combined with that, the impact of Brexit and the growing difficulty of immigration in the UK, meaning that we can't, even if that were an option, rely on other countries training interpreters and translators and then us exploiting that resource. So it really is a very difficult picture. I'm not saying for a moment we should be exploiting other countries' interpreters and translators, by the way. I'm just saying, you know, it's a really worrying picture. I think there are going to be big gaps. I think if anything, the need's going to grow. But I'm afraid I'm not aware of any research off the top of my head that I can point to which would provide data on that. But I can certainly go and look it up and then be in touch afterwards if somebody wants to get in touch with me.
Okay, I can certainly pass on the details. Another question for you, Jo. So are there arrangements for social service staff working with new arrivals to be kept in the loop of arrangements regarding this kind of assignments?
Brilliant question. So this particular project was only looking at the police and the Home Office, because that was where we got the interest from to start with. But we're about to put in a funding bid which will be aiming to spread the approach across the entire criminal justice sector. So that will be looking at the probation service, prisons and other areas as well. So that's one strand where there will be a bit of a spread. But the other thing we are very keen to do is improve understanding of how to work effectively with interpreters in other settings too. So one project we've got funded at the moment is looking at maternity settings in the UK, and that's working with what's called the Shared Services Partnership. So that's a group of public service organisations which meet to share good practice. So the fire service, the NHS, a whole range of services. And one of the things we got funding in that project for, it's a PhD project that's funded for 4 years. And we're working with collaborators in industry and in the NHS. And one of the things we got funding for is a big free conference at the end where we'll be able to share good practice on the integration of telephone and remote video interpreting in maternity settings. And clearly, because of COVID, that's what's really pushing that one. So unfortunately, you know, I'm hopeful that COVID will be at least much better managed, if not completely over, by the time that project is over in 2 years' time. But the idea is that very much there's a huge need for this kind of knowledge, and there's a huge appetite among a whole range of services, social workers, hospitals, schools. Across the piece, there are huge needs and growing needs. We're a very diverse society, and you know that's not going to change. That's always been the case through human history. Societies tend to be diverse, and people move. So it's going to carry on, if anything, growing. And there's a lot of work to do there. And I do think that's, you know, something that researchers can do a bit, but there's a lot of work there for linguists too. I think there's a big appetite for experts in the field the interpreters who work in the area to share knowledge. So it's really great when you see things like Simon's approach of trying to do joint training, and I know others do that too, and are really pushing that in various contexts. So I'm hopeful in that sense, because I think there are lots of good people trying to do that work.
Just one more quick question for you, Jo. In terms of best practices, so you mentioned the APP, which is aimed at detectives or police officers. Is there one for interpreters?
Thank you. No, so obviously there is good practice shared by professional organisations like the ITI, like the IOL, like the APCI, the Association of Police and Court Interpreters. There's a new organisation, the Association of Interpreters and Translators, NERPSI. I mean, I know the professionals listening to this will be aware of these organisations. So many of them do have codes of conduct, have guides to good practice in various settings, offer CPD training. So there are lots of ways you can certainly access some of that information, but our work was very much focused at making sure the investigators were equipped to work effectively with interpreters rather than the other way around. And the reason for that was the police were concerned at the point where they were told they had to outsource services. And this isn't a decision that's taken by public services themselves. This is something that is typically expected of them or imposed on them. And when that happens, they typically want to make sure that they prepare their in-house staff. That's all they can do, really, to know how to work professionally and to raise concerns if there are any concerns around the quality of provision as the way they secure services changes. So that's very much what our guidance was aiming to do. And it's much easier to do that with the police because they are a regulated profession. They have one national body which regulates their training and which has to sign off any changes to practice. And that's not the case for interpreters, translators and others who work in languages. So it's a more difficult thing to do, and it wasn't our direct focus in this project. But I would point people to some of the really good resources that are out there from professional associations and others.
Thank you, Jo. You did provide us with quite a lot of resources today. So, question for Simon. If there is some sort of problem with the way the victim is treated, especially in a medical setting, if, as a result of a physical examination, the interpreter feels that something is not quite right, who should we complain to? Usually the agency is not, it is not very helpful in this regard.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question. If there's I can't speak about a medical setting, but within a police setting, the role of the interpreter is to independently interpret. However, if the interpreter was to pick up on certain issues with the victim, they may well, for instance, pick up because the language barrier before the police would maybe mental health, autism, etc. Then I would expect, and it's unusual for it to happen, but I would expect the interpreter to actually raise that with the interviewing officer, so as that could be dealt with. If it's simply that the victim is difficult to speak to, then that's often the case with the language barrier or not. We don't always have the easiest of people to speak to, but if there was a particular issue such as health with the interviewee, I would, and I think the judiciary would expect the interpreter to raise that as a professional issue.
Okay, thank you. Another question that has come in. Are police officers, detectives trained? As in, do they know they need to work with interpreters who can also do chuchotage, simultaneous interpretation?
This was one of the reasons why I set up 5 years ago, or why I sort of helped interpreters, because I did mention right at the start, I'd spent a lot of time trying to say to the police, we need this training, we need to work better with interpreters, because interviewing is my sort of thing and my background professionally. And I have to say, a lot of it fell on deaf ears. There is no national training package that all police get. It's very kind of hit and miss. it's very piecemeal. The culture of CPD is very different, and it does sound critical of police, but you know, I've kind of been there and done that and seen that, and interpreters are much more open to CPD. And one of the things that all of my training with interpreters is born from them telling me what they need. So an interpreter will say, I need more information on interviewing a vulnerable witness, and we will provide that, and we build packages. Yet what was interesting, a fairly prominent figure within policing rang me one day and said, what do you cover on your seminars? And I told him a couple of things. He said, well, interpreters don't need to know that. And it was just laughable, really, because the reason why these seminars are full every single time is because interpreters tell me what they need and we provide the information they want. So there's a bit of a resistance to learning within the police, generally speaking, and the APP is a classic example. It's a fantastic piece of work, but actually getting each and every officer to read and understand it is a challenge and a discussion we'll be having in 10 years' time, I would suspect.
Thank you very much, Simon. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So for the attendees, you will be receiving a certificate of attendance and a link to the webinar in the next few working days. That particular follow-up email will also contain an open question from Professor Druggan regarding today's sessions and what you took away from it. And just after this event finishes, you will be receiving a feedback form. Please do fill it in. It's quite short, and obviously it's a great opportunity to share your valuable views with us. So thank you to our speakers. We had very positive comments, and people are very grateful actually for your input and your insights. Thank you all for joining us today and for listening. Please don't forget the feedback forms. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.